To recap, we have had a second successful launching of an American astronaut. Obviously not as successful as the first one because the capsule itself was lost in the recovery operation.
The capsule has dropped. The capsule has been dropped by the helicopter. And it's dropped back into the water. Now, whether they can get it again before it sinks or not, that is going to be a major problem at this time.
Following a successful flight, the spacecraft Liberty Bell 7 splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean with what its pilot, Gus Grissom, would describe as a good bump. After completing his post-splashdown tasks, he called in the helicopter and waited for what should have been a routine recovery. In part 2, I will cover the dramatic events that followed Liberty Bell 7's return to the Earth, and a recovery that was anything but routine. The recovery process for this mission was very similar to the one used on Alan Shepard's flight, the main difference being how the space pilot would open the hatch. Upon splashdown, Grissom would have informed the prime recovery helicopter ET-32 when he was ready to exit. The recovery force included 3 helicopters, as described by Bob Thompson, who worked in the recovery operations branch. We would have the primary recovery helicopter, we would have an alternate helicopter in case the first one had any problem, then we had one just kind of a camera helicopter in the background to not get involved. To reduce the weight of the US Marine helicopters performing the spacecraft recovery, the crew was reduced from 4 to 2. During the actual recovery of the spacecraft, the pilot would hold the helicopter steady while the co-pilot worked at the side door. The first thing he would have to do is cut off the long recovery antenna with a cutter at the end of a pole. This may sound a difficult task, but it was easier than the initial idea put forward of using a 40-foot copper wire as an aerial hoisted above the spacecraft by a helium balloon. In this scenario, the hazard the aerial presented to the helicopter was supposed to be removed by the co-pilot using a shotgun to hit the balloon. After cutting off the long recovery antenna, a line would have been attached to the top of the spacecraft. When the line was secured, the helicopter would have raised the spacecraft a short way out of the water. This was important because the lower hatch sill was below the waterline. The helicopter crew would have then lowered a horse collar recovery harness and instructed Grissom to exit the spacecraft. It had been considered recovering the spacecraft by helicopter with the space pilot inside the cockpit, but after one spacecraft was dropped during testing, it was decided it was safe to have the space pilot get out. The pilot of the helicopter that day had been Wayne Coons, and he stated, "I felt then like Gus Grissom felt later. Everybody blamed me because I was the guy at the controls. Everybody figured that I had done something." Like Grissom, Coons would not suffer from losing a spacecraft, and went on to be the pilot of the helicopter that had recovered Alan Shepard and the Freedom 7 spacecraft. Upon receiving the all clear to egress, Grissom would have removed his helmet. Up until this point, he would have kept it on because the microphones and headphones needed to communicate with the helicopter were fixed inside it. Next, he would have jettisoned the hatch and manoeuvred so that the top half of his body was outside of the spacecraft and he was sitting on the hatch sill. He would then have placed the harness under his arms and he would have been winched up into the helicopter, and then he and the spacecraft would have been flown to the recovery ship. Following splashdown, Grissom had activated his recovery aid devices. The long recovery antenna on top of the spacecraft was deployed and the green dye marker was deposited into the sea. A bag had been inflated in the nose of the spacecraft and pushed out the reserve parachute to help in keeping the spacecraft from being top heavy. Grissom released the straps holding him in place and undid his helmet, but left it on. This allowed for both communications to be maintained and the rubber neck dam to be unrolled. The several days that the neck dam had been rolled up before the mission had made it harder to unroll because it had wanted to keep assuming the rolled up position. Grissom said, "It's a chore to secure the dam and I didn't think I'd need it. Fortunately, I reconsidered." Happy that no water was leaking into the spacecraft, he removed the safety wires from the hatch that were used to prevent injury to anyone outside and discarded them at the bottom of the cockpit. He also transferred the rescue knife from its position attached to the hatch to his survival pack. At one point, it had been considered having the hatch welded in place and having the pilot egress the spacecraft by using a knife, something detailed by Dr. Robert Rose, one of the men who trained the astronauts. The metal was very thin, so if the astronaut had a can opener, he could cut himself out of there. Understandably, being welded into the spacecraft didn't go down too well with the astronauts, so a hatch that could be opened was built. But even so, the Randall Astro knife had been included as a backup. Gordon Cooper stated, "The survival knife we wound up with is one of the strongest knives ever made. You could probably slice your way right through the capsule wall with it, if you had to." As the spacecraft bobbed in the Atlantic swell, Grissom also faithfully removed the protective cover from the detonator plunger and removed the safety pin. Afterwards, Grissom would admit to Bob Thompson that he had gotten ahead of the recovery procedure by doing both of these actions before the helicopter had hooked on and while the hatch sill was still below the waterline. Thompson would say he just shouldn't have done it until he was told to do it. It's just that simple. With the recovery helicopters now on station, Grissom asked them to stand off for a few minutes while he noted the readings on the control panel. At the end of Shepard's flight, the recovery helicopter crew had hurried him out of the spacecraft, so he hadn't noted all of the readings that he had wanted to. It is reported that while Freedom 7 was being transported by helicopter to the carrier, some of the dial readings on the control panel were lost. To prevent any repeat of this, Grissom had wanted more time to note down the readings from his control panel before his spacecraft was recovered. When this task was completed, he had called for the primary recovery helicopter, call sign Hunt Club 1, and piloted by Lieutenant James Lewis, to come in and hook onto the spacecraft. As he waited for the all clear to vacate the cockpit, he thought about retrieving the knife for a souvenir. He also relayed that he had unhooked his oxygen pipe, which was causing him to heat up in his spacesuit. Maybe a little hint at the helicopter crew to hurry up and get him out. The second crew member of Hunt Club 1 was Lieutenant John Reynard, and as Lewis held the helicopter steady, Reynard worked at the side door and started to cut the lung recovery antenna with a cutting tool. Suddenly, the mild explosive fuse surrounding the hatch sill detonated, sending the hatch out over the waves. Grissom would say of this, "I'm just laying there, minding my own business, when pow, the hatch went. I looked up and I saw nothing but blue sky and water starting to come in over the sill." Given the difficulty for an astronaut to get into a Mercury spacecraft cockpit, the speed with which Grissom exited Liberty Bell 7 was impressive. So fast was his exit that he didn't even have time to grab his inflatable survival raft or close his suit's oxygen inlet valve, two measures that nearly cost him his life. The only two moves I remember making was tossing my helmet off and grabbing the instrument panel and pulling myself out. I only remember grabbing the instrument panel. I don't even remember going out the door. I have never moved faster in my life. The next thing I knew, I was floating high in my suit with the water up to my armpits. After exiting the spacecraft, a new danger had emerged. Grissom was entangled in the line used to keep the die marker in close proximity to the spacecraft. He said afterwards, "The spacecraft was obviously sinking and I was concerned that I might be pulled down with it." Getting free of this line, he saw Hunt Club 1, now with its wheels in the water, try to hook onto the spacecraft. Despite the danger of getting entangled again, he swam back to help Reynard attach the line. Lewis said, "Fortunately, the first time John tried, he managed to hook up while the capsule was totally submerged." As he watched the helicopter start to raise the spacecraft, Grissom waited for his turn to be recovered, but no such help came. Under normal conditions, once the helicopter had hooked onto the spacecraft, it would have lowered a line for Grissom, but it was now preoccupied with trying to save the spacecraft. Lewis stated, "I made the decision then not to lower the collar for Gus because we knew that he could float in his suit. We'd seen him do it in training, and we were not concerned about Gus." Lewis would go as far as to say that in his experience of the recovery training, the astronauts enjoyed being in the water, but as the rotor wash from the helicopter battered his face and he struggled in the swell of the Atlantic Ocean, Grissom was having anything but an enjoyable time. He would later admit swimming around in the suit was pretty difficult, always trying to keep my head up above the water. As Grissom watched on, the now fully submerged spacecraft rose from the ocean, water pouring out of its open hatch and its water-soaked landing bag dragging through the ocean. The impact bag had holes around it to let air escape from it upon splashdown to cushion the impact. These holes had now let in about 4 tons of seawater, but this had been expected and indeed utilised to stabilise the spacecraft. Although it wasn't normally a problem because this seawater was lost as it was raised up, it did put an additional strain on the helicopter. The problem was the additional seawater flooding the cockpit. As Lewis recalled, "We knew from past experience that we would be unable to lift the capsule plus the water in it, but we tried anyway. I got most of the heat shield out of the water, but then one of these 4-foot waves came along and dragged it back down. To add to the pressure of the situation, a warning light came on in the helicopter's cockpit." Wayne Coons stated, "What that's telling you is that the engine internally is shredding some steel, because the detector is 2 magnetic points, and if you complete the circuit between those points, that light comes on." Typically when the light comes on, the engine will run for a little while. It's also typical when the light comes on that it's just a chunk of carbon that's come loose inside the engine that happened to lodge in between those electrical points, so he had no way of knowing which it was. Concentrating on the battle to save the spacecraft, Lewis manoeuvred the helicopter out of the way to allow the alternate helicopter to move in and make the recovery of Grissom. Although he had utilised the neck dam on his spacesuit, something Grissom would describe as the best thing I did all day, he was still in danger of sinking. Under normal recovery conditions, the fact that he had left his oxygen inlet valve open would not have mattered, but now that he was in the sea, it was adding to his predicament. He said, "In the rush to get out before I sank, I had not closed the air inlet port. Although this hole was not letting much water in, it was letting air seep out, and I needed that air to help me stay afloat." As well as the open valve letting air escape, the neck dam was also allowing air to be expelled, because it wasn't quite as tight around his neck as it should have been. This loss of air, coupled with the seawater seeping in, caused the buoyancy of his suit to be drastically affected. As well as the seawater entering his suit, Grissom had carried souvenirs inside his spacesuit pocket. These included 100 dimes, small souvenir models of the spacecraft, 2 sets of pilot's wings, and according to some sources, a string of pearls for his mother. He later admitted, "These were all adding weight that I could have done without." To add to his misery, a second helicopter was now hovering close by and returning his frantic waves with friendly waves while taking photos. This was of course the camera helicopter who had been advised not to get involved. Failure was turning into farce, and NASA was in danger of suffering its first space pilot fatality, because although Grissom managed to close the oxygen valve, the ocean swell was hitting him in the face and the exhausted pilot was coming close to drowning. He noted of his predicament afterwards, "Well, you've gone through the whole flight and now you're going to sink right here in front of all these people." Fortunately for Grissom, the backup helicopter, ET-30, flown by Captain Philip Upshult, moved in with a lowered recovery collar slowly moving towards him. With his focus on the man in the water, Lieutenant George Cox watched from the helicopter side door as a relieved Grissom finally managed to put the recovery device on. Although he had it on backwards, the collar was now around Grissom's upper body, and after first dragging him through the ocean, the helicopter winched him up to safety. He would later say that his fight to stay afloat in the water had seemed like an eternity. Having escaped drowning once, he spent the flight to the recovery carrier attaching a life preserver, just in case he ended up back in the ocean for whatever reason. It had been a harrowing experience, and Grissom said of it, "I wondered why the men in the door of the chopper did not try coming in after me. I suppose the crew did not realise how much trouble I was in. I tried to rouse them by waving my arms, but they just seemed to wave back at me. I wasn't scared now, I was angry." In his book, Flight, Christopher Kraft, the Mercury flight director, claims that Grissom had laid into the helicopter crew during the flight back to the carrier, but decided against filing a complaint against them because he was just so relieved to be alive. As Grissom was being saved, Liberty Bell 7 was being lost. Lewis said, "We hovered for 2 or 3 minutes at maximum power in an attempt to get the capsule out of the water, but because of the engine trouble, we released it and came back to the ship." He would later write, "With oil pressure dropping, cylinder head temperature rising, and Gus safely aboard ET-30, we commend LB-7 to the deep." Later, analysis showed that the helicopter could have proceeded with the spacecraft retrieval, but as George Cox pointed out, you don't question those lights at the time. Safely on the USS Randolph, a waterlogged Grissom exited the helicopter and was rushed below decks, much to the disappointment of the sailors gathered around to see his return. It had been a bad day, but it could have been much worse, as NASA official Marty Burns pointed out immediately after the mission. "We've got only one Gus, but we've got plenty of space capsules." The only part of the spacecraft structure to be recovered was the nose cone. The rest of Liberty Bell 7 would have to wait 38 years. As he removed his flight gear, Grissom took a telephone call from President Kennedy, who congratulated him on his spaceflight, but in the pictures he seems anything but happy. In fact, he was bitterly disappointed to have lost his spacecraft, stating, "It was especially hard for me as a professional pilot. In all my years of flying, including combat in Korea, this was the first time that my aircraft and I had not come back together. In my entire career as a pilot, Liberty Bell was the first thing I had ever lost." As if nearly drowning wasn't bad enough, the crew of a rescue ship had retrieved his helmet, and when it was presented to him afterwards, the naval officer reported, "We found it floating right next to a 10-foot shark." The loss of the spacecraft sparked a wave of accusations and finger-pointing. Theories both implicating and clearing Grissom were put forward, and the mystery surrounding the loss of Liberty Bell 7 began.
I was just laying there minding my own business, and then pow! A hatch went. I looked up and I saw nothing but blue sky and water starting to come in over the sill. Without a doubt, that was the biggest shock of the day to me, to see that door go off.